Hello, I'm Chuck Wolf, Chief Executive for Charles J. Wolf Associates, LLC. As a motivational speaker and a leadership consultant and executive coach and trainer, I often work with very successful people in their companies. Since many can't afford a professional, I volunteer to host a radio talk show called The Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel, on a nonprofit community radio station in Bridgeport, Connecticut, WPKN. My reason for doing the show is to share with as many people as possible this wonderful process for helping people manage their own emotions and their relationships with others. My goal is for everyone listening to learn to use the Emotion Roadmap to make life better. As you listen to me, help others, I hope you are also learning. As a Simsbury resident, I'm delighted to be able to make the show available through Simsbury TV. To learn more, go to my website, www.emotionroadmap.com. Thank you for listening and watching. Hi, you're listening to WPKN 89.5 FM. This is Chuck Wolf, and you're listening to the Emotion Roadmap. Take the wheel and control how you feel. It's great to be back with you again, and we have a wonderful guest this week. We're going to be talking to a person named Brian Uzi, and I'm going to read his bio in a few minutes, but I want to tell you why we want to talk to Brian. He wrote a wonderful article called Make Your Enemies Your Allies. And our show is all about managing your own emotions and the emotions of others. And a lot of people have a hard time when they think of someone as an enemy or an adversary. And Brian's got some terrific strategies for how to move your enemies into a camp where you now see them as allies. Brian is the Richard L. Thomas Distinguished Professor of Leadership at the Kellogg School of Management, Northwestern University. He also co-directs NICO, the Northwestern University Institute on Complex Systems, and holds professorships in sociology and the McCormick School of Engineering. His award-winning and highly cited research examines the link between social networks and outstanding human achievement. Media reports of his research frequently appear worldwide in the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, on television, and in the New Yorker magazine. He's won 10 teaching awards, lectured internationally, and been on the faculties of Harvard University, INSEAD, University of Chicago, and the University of California at Berkeley, where he was the Warren E. and Carol Speaker Professor of Leadership. Brian, it's a delightful pleasure to have you with us, and we're going to be talking today about the article you wrote for Harvard Business Review that attracted me to you about making your enemies your allies. I was intrigued by what you wrote because our world here on the radio show is all about helping people to manage their own emotions and their emotional relationships with others. And one of the places that smart people often get stuck is when they feel as though somebody is acting in an adversarial way in the workplace, and it's making it really hard for them to get things done. And I really liked your design. You had some very practical, tactical ways to help make people your allies. And so I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your background in terms of research that you came up with this profile and template for guiding people from turning people who are seemingly adversaries into possible and hopefully promising allies.
Well, good morning, Chuck. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that very nice introduction. The work that I reported in the Harvard Business Review came from a lot of case studies that I've heard over the years in the work I've done with many executives in many different industries around the world when they face these problems of how do they deal with their rivals at work or their rivals out in the marketplace. And I was able to combine a lot of those case studies, kind of the one-on-one examples that are very rich in detail with information from the literature that really helped put a framework around all the different case studies so that you'd be able to see a singular pattern across them that could then be adopted and used by other people when they face similar problems of rivalry in the workplace.
Can you give us a kind of a key example? You talk about coming up with a template, and you have the 3 R's that you talk about, and that's what I kind of liked about the model. And in my emotion roadmap, I'm trying to help people to think a little bit about how they are feeling, and that's the piece where you identify what is, and then how it would be ideal to feel for themselves and anybody key to what they're working with. And then how do you get from what is to what's ideal? So the way I thought about what you were doing was you have a strategy that helps to create the new feelings. When somebody feels like, someone's undermining them at work, someone is trying to, steal their thunder, take credit perhaps for what they've done, or just creating obstacles and making it difficult for them to achieve anything. Your feelings, you become frustrated, you become angry, and instead you want to feel like you're supported and you're supportive of the other people. And so your strategy to redirect, reciprocity, this idea of you give something to someone and that you change the way they're thinking and that you explain it all through rationality, I just liked it as a strategy. So if you can give us some kind of concrete example of, I know you presented one in the text, and probably a lot of people haven't seen that, so you could use that or another one that might be simple for you to explain.
Sure. So, those are all good questions. I think the way to think about this is, for many people, when they have these problems, the first thing they have to do is really think about what is the way to conceptualize the problem. You could think about rivalry in the workplace as kind of a chronic disease that you just sort of live with, and you live with the pain. You could think about it in a very adversarial way yourself, which is I really need to neutralize my foe. Or you could think about it as, more or less a wound that if you treat it properly, it's going to allow you to become stronger with time and be more successful. And I think a lot of the emotional orientation that you begin with when you start to think about how to deal with rivals really starts with that. Is it a chronic problem? Is it going to be, a foe you need to neutralize, or is it going to be a wound you're going to heal? And I find that when I work with executives, those that believe in the latter, that it's a wound that they can heal, typically go on to be able to solve these problems best, because they're really starting from the best place themselves emotionally.
Well, the idea, I like the metaphor when I read about it in the article of, trying to discern if this was chronic. The idea is that it's ongoing. It isn't going away. You just have to learn to live with it, versus a wound that's something that can be healed over time.
Yes, exactly. And I think the other reason to think about it this way is that the other part of rivalry is it's not just between two people. One of the things that you always observe around executives, even if they're not conscious of it when you begin talking to them, is that when you have rivalry, it often includes third parties. And rivalry tends to split the network in any organization, so you wind up getting two communities, and then those communities become rivals with each other because people need to take sides. And one of the real insights of being able to turn a rival into a collaborator is that if you're able to repair that relationship, you not only do better on a dyadic level with that person, both in terms of being able to exchange information and make deals and feel better emotionally, but you also become someone who is an original bridge in that network in the organization, which really exposes you to a lot more information and a lot more relationships. So you really have to think about these sort of things more broadly, and that can often be motivating to people to put the effort into treating this not as something chronic that they live with, but something that they should work on to really take it to the next level of healing that wound. The other thing I'd say, to kind of get people to begin to think about this is that lots of these rivalries don't have to be intentional. So some people think it comes about because, you did something intentional to the other side, or you're going after someone else's resources. But most rivalries really come about because you've created some kind of threat or fear in the other person, and that in itself can be completely unintentional. So if you're a creative, forward-looking person, you're brought into the organization because of the fresh thinking that you're likely to bring with you, that in itself can often cause rivals unintentionally. So the very thing that you're there to do becomes in conflict with your ability to form relationships with the people you need to work with to be successful. So lots of people wind up having these problems, and it may not be because of direct interactions with other individuals. It may just be because they see you from afar as a threat. And that's really what you got to understand about rivalry and how you go about treating it emotionally. And it really begins with this. Most people, when you talk to them about rivalry, they treat it in a very rational way. what I need, someone else needs. It's a competition over resources. We have a similar skill base. We're competing for the same job, so on and so forth. And really what you need to understand is underneath it all, there's a very strong emotional undercurrent. See, most of what leads to rivalry is really when you evoke fear or threat in the other person. And what that means is that before you can ever address the problems that may be about resources, you really have to address the emotional basis of it first. And the reason for that is that once someone is put into a state of threat, no matter what you say or what you do, it will become twisted and turned to be in line with those negative feelings of threat and rivalry. So even if you were to approach someone who is your rival and present them with the best deal in the world, something that would be truly enhancing to their own behavior, something they may not get from anybody else, something that could really attract them to want to work with you again, unless you deal with the emotional basis first, no matter what you present to them will become turned and twisted in a negative way. That's really what creates this kind of feud-like behavior in lots of rivalries. So the structure that I tried to put together in the article was really meant to have people understand this basis of the emotional underpinnings of turning rivals into collaborators. And this is not just a psychological concept. Much physiological research, and some of which that I brought into the article, really goes to show that when a human being feels threat, whether it's like a dog barking in your face, or if you step off the corner when you're texting and you look up and you see a car coming towards you, you have this sense of feeling like you've lost a pint of blood. And the reason for that is that when you feel these feelings of fear or threat, the brain actually has a physiological change in it. The blood that's typically in the cerebral cortex, that's the thinking part of the brain, the part of the brain that will eventually evaluate whether this relationship is a good one or a bad one moving forward, the blood that's there, that's needed to do that thinking, recedes to the oldest part of the brain known as the reptilian stem. And once it recedes into the reptilian stem, the brain is not good at processing information at all. So what lots of people do is they try to treat rivalry in a very rational way. They go to the person with a deal, and they expect the person to take the deal because from their point of view as the giver, it looks like such a good bargain for the other side, but the other side can't see it because they're stuck in this reptilian stem mode. And you have to deal with the reptilian stem first.
Oh, that's fascinating. As you're talking, and I hope that other listeners, when they're listening to you, are also thinking about real life situations for themselves. And what I'm struggling with is I have like so many of them popping up about where this is relevant. Is it my client work? Is it my own family dynamics? Is it because I think that the kind of things that you're speaking about often get unnoticed, except that they're in play. And people, in the work that I do, is I find people get stuck because they don't know what to do with the emotion part of it. Mm-hmm. So the first part is just recognizing that it's there. And I think when you come into an organization, one of the first examples you began to speak about, and you bring in fresh ideas, and you think that you've joined an organization that, and everyone has said how welcome you are, yet there are people that are going to be there that are threatened by what you might take from them, or how you might become the star that they were hoping to be, and somehow you're going the sun that shines on you is not going to be shining on them somehow. And you may not even think about that when you first step into a new world and a new organization. And I think what you're suggesting is, at least in the way I think about it, Brian, is think about ahead of time emotionally how others might see your entry. And what you're suggesting is that those that might be fearful for any reason, and some rational, some not so rational, how do you address that proactively? Because that's the sense that I have about this emotion roadmap concept, is that be proactive about your emotions. Don't wait until some emotional landmine that you know about goes off without thinking about how to diffuse it.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And I think the other part of this is, at least the way that Shannon and I talked about it in the article, is that dealing with emotions does not necessarily mean that you have to play psychologist. You don't have to undo all the negative emotions that the person has towards you. In fact, I don't know if I would recommend that. That's a very complex process to even get involved in. And what our process tried to do, this 3R process, was to show you a way that you could deal with these emotions without having to play psychologist. And the way we did this is we developed a framework, as you've already mentioned, called the 3Rs. And if you do these 3Rs, the first R being redirection, the second R being reciprocity, and the third R being rationality, and you do them in these steps, in this order, you're likely to be able to turn this rival into collaborator. And the first step, redirection, is really about how you deal with those negative emotions. And the basic idea behind that is this. You don't want to play psychologist and try to undo all the negative emotions, which could be wrapped up in lots of complex things. It could be the person feels threat. It could be that they're jealous. It could be they feel resentment. It could be, they're feeling disenfranchised. So you look at all of these emotions, you don't even know where to begin. And so the best thing to do is to boil down emotions to a single one, which research tells us over 80% of all negative human emotions boil down to just one, which is fear. And that's really what you want to deal with. And the question is, how do you do it in the methodology? Well, the first step is this idea of redirection. And redirection says, don't try to undo the other person's negative emotions, but instead try to redirect those emotions to something else. Research shows if you're able to redirect these negative emotions to something else that is from you to something else, that person's mind opens up, so to speak, so that you then can begin to present to them the rational basis for your desire to turn that rivalry into a collaboration, and at that point they'll be able to hear it.
Let me ask you about that, Brian, because when I read that in the article, there was a piece of me that had a bit of a conundrum trying to understand it. It seemed like you were trying to, if I heard you correctly, take that fear factor and suggest that fear factor be targeted someplace else, not remove it or replace it or understand it even, other than just kind of sort of guide it in a different direction away from you. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And, this is actually not such a foreign concept to people, particularly if you've dealt with young children. So I don't know if you've ever had the experience like trying to reason with a kid that's really upset. Maybe somebody young, like a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, someone who, doesn't try to hide their emotions, but really the emotions they show are their true emotions at the time. So what would be an example? So let's say you're coming home from the mall, you've got your son or daughter in the back seat in their car seat, and they're really upset. They want another ice cream cone. And they're kicking the back of the seat, and they're screaming they want more ice cream. And what you try to do is you try to reason with them. You say, well, I've got ice cream at home. We don't have to pay for another one at the mall. Or you're in really nice clothes, and you're in the car seat. You're going to spill it on yourself. Or, you just had an ice cream cone. It's too soon to have another one. You try all these things to reason with the kid, and they just can't hear it. And then you do some act of redirection as a parent, which is basically to turn their attention to something else, which can turn off their emotions very quickly. So I remember one time I was having this exact experience with my son, and I said, oh, Jonas, look, out the window there's a red fire-breathing dragon. And I remember he just turned his head like a robot and looked for it. And I says, oh, it just disappeared. And at that moment he was redirected. After that, I was able to say to him, look, when we get home, we could have ice cream, we'll be able to do other things, and he was able to hear it at that point. And that's essentially what you're trying to do with adults. I mean, so much of persuasion, which is also part of this framework, is really about understanding what makes for good persuasion. And a lot of persuasion literature comes from the study of children, because children don't hide their true underlying motives and desires or emotions. And when they're visible, then you can understand how to actually deal with them.
This is really very interesting on a lot of levels. I ride a horse, and one of the ways someone who was training me to ride a horse suggested that when a horse is stubborn about not wanting to cross a certain kind of terrain, whether it's a little brook or just something that frightens it, if you turn them and you get their attention focused in another direction and you come back to that, they forget that they were even concerned about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea is, it works with animals. I've also seen, my wife is actually excellent at that. I'd seen her many times when the conversation took a funny tack at the dinner table with adults or children. She's able to introduce kind of a segue to another topic that's much less controversial, and it takes the tension right out of the air.
Yes, and that's precisely what you're looking to do. And that's a much easier, much more doable outcome than really trying to play psychologist, which I think also tends to turn some people off because they really don't feel capable of doing that. So for like a concrete example, one that I used in the article, maybe that's a good one to start with, is an executive who allowed himself to be interviewed as part of the article. His name is John Clendenin. He tells a story of he was laterally hired into an organization. It was Xerox. And he was put in charge of a 20-year senior individual. And he was fresh out of his MBA. He was only about 30 years old. And he was put into a position that the 20-year veteran believed should have been his position. Now, John didn't really have anything to do with the fact that he was put in charge of this person through a lateral hire. But nonetheless, the person started to develop negative feelings towards John because John threatened him and his position in the organization. It was a signal to this 20-year veteran that, Xerox was changing the way it thought about management. It pulled out the rug of the 20-year individual thinking, I've built up all of these skills with all this anticipation, and now I'm told that it's no longer part of what, is going to help me move up in the ranks, and a number of other things. And he was directing these negative emotions towards John. And at the same time, John realized on rational grounds that he really needed this 20-year veteran. 20-year veteran had a lot of information about the firm, stuff that was not in the written documents, soft cultural information about how to approach problems. And the 20-year veteran also had a lot of contacts around Xerox that if John did not build the relationship well with the 20-year veteran, the contacts of the 20-year veteran would probably also begin to look at John with some suspicion. So John felt like he really needed him. At the same time, John knew that the 20-year veteran needed John. He needed John for job security and advancement. He needed John because if he really wanted to move up in the ranks, he needed someone who he could shadow as a leader so that he could develop the same kind of leadership capabilities. And, he probably was looking for a way to really redeem himself in his colleagues' eyes in the sense that when you're passed over for a promotion, it's a really shaming experience. Now, John could have gone to him and explained what I just explained right now in a very rational way and said, hey, look, what you need, I have, and what I need, you have. We shouldn't be rivals at all. We should be a marriage made in heaven. But in fact, that could not have taken place until John dealt with the redirection of the negative emotions first. If he had simply presented the deal to Tom like that, we're a marriage made in heaven, Tom probably would have rejected it. He would have looked at it with suspicion and probably would have turned it to be in line with his negative feelings, that thinking somehow all of this is really just a Trojan horse that John is presenting to him. So the concrete thing is, well, how do you do the redirection? So let me start with the example that I use in the article with John and this 20-year veteran, and then talk more broadly about it. So here's what John does. The first thing he does is he finds out where this 20-year veteran has his favorite restaurant, and instead of having the conversation at work in John's office, which is going to be the conversation that he has to present to Tom at some point to begin to turn that rivalry into collaboration, he instead brings Tom to his favorite restaurant. How is that an act of redirection in itself? Well, it's an act of redirection in a lot of different levels, as simple as it may seem and as plain as it is, in the sense that, first of all, Tom is in an environment relative to the environment where a conversation like this typically takes place, which is the boss's office. And it happens in the boss's office because the boss wants to be in a position of authority in a situation that's also threatening to him or her. But you see, when you do it in your own office, if you're the boss in this particular situation, then you're only resting on the crutch of your own authority, which isn't going to show the other person that you're going to be able to reduce their fears. So right away you go back into this cycle of emotions being driven by fears rather than being able to remove them. Plus, if you go to the person's favorite office, it's already showing to them that you're willing to make an investment in them, which is very important to signal. It can't be a one-shot, you do something for me, I do something for you, but it's got to be a longer-term horizon in order to turn that rivalry into collaboration. And one thing that signals that is that I'm willing to make an investment. And John does that when he takes him to his favorite restaurant. It's also a much better context, which also influences people's emotions. So John's being very shrewd at the way he does this. And then he also uses a direct statement of redirection to start the whole conversation. And what he basically says is that to the 20-year veteran, I didn't put you in this situation of being passed over for the position. Actually, Xerox, the company, did because they made the decision, which in fact is John redirecting Tom's emotions towards Xerox, which in this case is completely valid. But he also goes a step further, also influencing Tom's emotions, which is, guess what? You and I are more like each other than unlike each other. And that also begins to form a basis of redirection from Tom seeing him as an adversary to Tom seeing him as someone who is on the same side of the table as him. And that's how you begin with redirection.
One of the things that strikes me as I'm listening to you, Brian, is a lot of people that are having these issues at work, and I can't think of anyone that I know that hasn't had something along the lines of what we're talking about, where they have conflict that shows up with different people on an ongoing basis with some key characters that are important to their work life. And as you're talking, and I'm thinking about what you're saying, it occurs to me that there is a sense of you don't want just a transactional change. You're looking for a transformational change. And you're asking people to be not tactical but strategic and really think through like a plan, almost like a project plan, that there are several parts to this. And the way you're explaining it, the first part, which you've just done a nice job explaining, is here's the context, here's what we're facing. And different than the fire-breathing red dragon, which I was going to ask you, how do people feel about when you tell them that something is there and it isn't, and you've lied to them? Because that's a piece of it. But this isn't. This is true. Xerox was the reason why this happened, and so Tom may be caught off guard about why he's talking about that. But if he thinks it through, the person John coming in had nothing to do with this.
That's right. Authenticity is very important. And I wouldn't recommend doing things that are not authentic. And this is where human creativity comes in. I can't answer. I don't think anybody can every situation and what would be appropriate forms of redirection in every situation, unless you have a lot of knowledge of that person's specific situation. But the idea is that you're shooting for that concept of something that redirects and that person's negative emotions from you to something else. And abstractly speaking, the best thing of redirection is to say that there was some third party or third entity that was beyond my control and the control of my rival that actually put us into this situation together. And if you can do that, that's that first step of redirection.
That makes a lot of sense. And then one of the things that struck me as I read your article was many years ago I read something by Ben Franklin that said if you were looking to make an enemy a friend, then you can ask them a favor, actually asking them for something. And yours was giving something to them. So it's a little different, but it reminded me of that. Mm-hmm. You want to talk a little bit about how that works?
So here's the way this works is if you're successful in redirection, your next step is called reciprocity. And reciprocity really boils down to this. You've got to give before you ask, give before you ask, give before you ask if you want to build a relationship. Now, why is that so important? The important thing is that most people's first step is to think that they're going to build a relationship by laying out a very even quid pro quo. And the problem with that is that if you lay out a very even quid pro quo, you don't create a new relationship, you create a single one-shot transaction. I give you, Charles, something you need, and Charles, you give me something I need, and after that's done, our obligations to each other are finished. And that might be the beginning and the end of anything you ever do with your rival. It's not helping you go forward to new things where you might need that person to help you and vice versa. The way you do that is really through giving before you ask, giving before you ask. Now, this in a way goes back to a very basic thing about building all kinds of relationships. In fact, all relationships begin, that is, ones that turn out to be strong relationships, when you give before you ask. And it works for a lot of different reasons. The analogy I like to use is if you give before you ask, what happens is you put yourself in partly a vulnerable position, which the other person sees, which helps them reduce their fears and the threat that you can make towards them because they feel as if they're in a more powerful position. And then the other thing is that if you give before you ask, you actually create indebtedness in the other person. And that makes them want to relieve that indebtedness by paying you back. And if you can make that virtuous cycle grow, then you have a relationship through time. The analogy that I often like to use is an analogy that comes from the olden days when we used to keep water in the bottom of a well. It's called priming the pump. And it worked like this. Typically, if you wanted water in the olden days, you'd go down to the well with a bucket, and you'd crank and crank and crank on a lever till you relieve the vacuum in the hose so that you can get pressure out of the well and fill your bucket. Priming the pump would say this: when you go down to the well, bring a small container of water, and before you start cranking on the lever of the well, pour the small container of water into the line. Now, if you do that, what happens is with just a fraction of the number of cranks that you would normally use to get full pressure out of the well, you in turn get full pressure. Why? Because that little bit of water takes the vacuum out of the line, and that's what allows the pressure to come up fast. By analogy, that vacuum in the line is really the absence of trust in the relationship. And the way you get rid of that absence of trust in part is by giving a small container of water or something to start the relationship. You've got to give before you ask. And that's really the reciprocity stage. Now, that could become complicated because as soon as you hear something like this, you're like, whoa, wait a minute. I want to give something to my rival. Aren't they just going to take it and never reciprocate? And that, in fact, can happen, and that's always a risk. However, if you work shrewdly within this framework, what you're really looking to do is to give things to the other person that they really value, so they're going to be likely to want to take it, but that automatically bring things back to you without that person feeling a pressure to reciprocate, which means you're giving them something, but you're also getting something back at the same time, which ultimately could reduce and nullify any potential losses that you have. So let me try to give you a concrete example. If we go back to John's with the 20-year veteran in the restaurant. He effectively does redirection, and what he says to the 20-year veteran is this. He says, I'm going to break a norm at Xerox with you, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to bring you to executive meetings with me, which is something the 20-year veteran would really value. I mean, think about it. It's going to give him exposure to top management. He's going to be able to show his skills and qualities to them, which in his own mind, and this may in fact be accurate, they did not value properly. It's going to give him a chance to shadow how other people operate in these meetings and present information and make arguments, things that he needs to know. And so he's going to be very likely to want to take advantage of going to those meetings with John. And that's what John's giving him first. But what does John automatically get back when he's got Tom in those meetings with him? What's going to happen is that his interests and Tom's interest are going to be aligned in that meeting, because what's going to make Tom look good is also going to make John look good. Now, Tom is not going to feel like John is pressuring him to get the information from him that John needs. He's going to do it because it's a consequence of that situation that John has put him into. And so what John has done is he's taken interests that were not aligned, and he's now aligned them through this reciprocity principle. That opportunity is also going to allow John to build more trust with Tom, because they're going to be able to get value from each other and see qualities that they couldn't before. It's also going to help John in the sense that if the 20-year veteran comes to these meetings, what's the 20-year veteran likely to say to all the other people he knows around the organization, and what are they likely to say about John? They're probably going to say, you know what, maybe we misjudged this guy, John, and we should give him the benefit of the doubt because he's doing some pretty amazing things with Tom. So John automatically gets things back by shrewdly using the reciprocity principle, and that's the main way in which you have to think about using this.
I want to get to the part that says, because some people are thinking about this and listening to you and say, that all presupposes that you've really been very, very clever about what it is that you can give to somebody that they're going to value. At the same time, subtly you're getting something back, so that you're not feeling frustrated that you're giving and nothing's coming in return. And you do have, as part of your article, this idea of when to recognize, when to look elsewhere. And I just want to, because I think it's really terrific that you've got a tactical, or even in my mind to some extent strategic idea about how to make this happen. There are going to be times when it's not going to work. And how do you know when it's not working? What are those signals?
Yeah, so I think one signal is that as you're thinking about this, if you yourself have a lot of insecurity about whether the reciprocity stage of this is going to be effective or not, you might want to postpone doing it until you feel that you have something that could be of value like this. Another thing you should do is probably talk to people whom you trust already to ask them how they're likely to react to this as well. So the first thing is if you think it's not going to work, it may be because you don't feel secure enough in your own understanding of the problem and of the own resources that you might be able to offer them. That's also a signal in the sense that if you can't think of something valuable enough to offer them, it may be that you yourself are trying to create a relationship with someone who you may never be able to form a relationship with because you lack the importance to them, or they may not really be important enough to you to actually do this. Your resources may be better spent on building another kind of relationship. Another way in which I think you get a signal back is that if you do this and it fails and the person does not reciprocate, that also becomes a very clear signal. But even if all of that happens, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. And what I mean by that is that lots of the relationships we have with each other, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the interview, is really through third parties. And if you fail to be able to change the relationship with the person at a dyadic level, in a partnership as a pair, you might be able to work through third parties. So imagine you don't have something that's going to trigger this reciprocity response in your rival. You may have something that you could do the same thing with someone who is close to that rival and has a good relationship with that rival. And then by building a relationship with this third common party that the two of you have through reciprocity and making that stronger, it's likely to spill over into the rival, because then the rival will see your trustworthy behavior with someone that they themselves trust, which is likely to make them think that you're more trustworthy.
That's another really neat idea. It's a great idea to kind of broaden the horizon for how you might deal with somebody who really isn't allowing you to get closer to them. Mm-hmm. I had mentioned this before. I think of this as really transformational, because if this works, and I encourage people to think about this, because I again, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about all kinds of relationships in different places, whether I'm advising people as an executive coach or it's someone that's a friend of mine who's struggling with another friend, because I'm just thinking of an incident this morning in a conversation where this is all relevant, or it's a family dynamic. I know we're talking about the workplace, but there are problematic relationships in families and in personal life as well as the professional life. And it seems like, ideally, if you have a game plan, which is what this represents for me, It's going to make you better if you stop and you think through all the different parts. And it starts with kind of helping people to understand that maybe there's something else out there that's causing the conflict. And if you can do that successfully, you take some of the pressure out of the situation right away.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you do something nice for somebody, it causes them to kind of at least think a bit differently, and you might call it cognitive dissonance about how they're looking at you.
Exactly.
And so it throws them a bit off balance. And now, why don't you talk a bit about this idea of rationality as the third R?
Sure. So that's the last step. And this is often a very hard step for people to go through, in the sense that even if they do the first two steps successfully, this is really, you really have to lay the deal on the table, and you almost have to go, toe-to-toe, eyeball to eyeball with the other person, and lay out the authority structure and how the resources are going to be divided in the relationship. And this can often be tough because it may put someone in a leadership role over the other person, or it may be that resources don't get divided evenly from your point of view because you may be putting more things in. Nonetheless, it's important to set these expectations now. I find that when executives do step 1 and step 2, which is redirection and reciprocity, but they leave out the last step of rationality, it winds up clearing up the problem for a short period of time until something happens. And then when that something happens, all the old problems come back, and they're much harder to fix because it turns into, well, you did this 3 months ago, but you did that, 3.5 months ago, and you did this 4 months ago, and you get this infinite regress of no one being able to say where the problem really had started, and it had no end point. Really, rationality is about creating a new starting point and creating an end point to the old conflict. And to do that, you've got to lay out, in a sense, a new contract. If we go back to the case that's used in the example with John Clendenin and the 20-year veteran, what John does at the end of that conversation, after he redirects Tom's negative emotions, he gives Tom this offer to come to executive meetings with him, which Tom is really eager to do. John goes and moves towards rationality. And what he says at the end here may sound harsh, but he's got the concept right. And what he says to the 20-year veteran is, I need you or someone like you if you decide to turn down this deal. Now, sometimes when people read those words, they think, wow, isn't this just another threat? He's basically telling the 20-year veteran that he's got options, and if the 20-year veteran doesn't take advantage of it, he's just going to go to somebody else anyway. Now, that may be your first way to look at it, but I think ultimately what it's really communicating is the true structure of the deal. I mean, John does have to communicate to this other person that he has responsibilities, that he has things that he has to accomplish, and that if the 20-year veteran is not going to move away from rivalry towards collaboration, he's going to have to move on to something else or someone else. And in fact, research shows that by actually saying that, you come off as more credible in wanting to make the deal. Why? Think about it this way. Imagine John's done the redirection, he's done the rationality, they're in the restaurant, and it ends like that on that note. When the 20-year veteran goes home that night, what's going to start going through his mind? He's going to start to think, wow, John was really great to me, he offered me all of these things, and then he's going to start to say, but, he never really mentioned that he's got all of these things that he has to accomplish too. And once that thought goes through the other person's mind, your rival's mind, what happens is distrust starts to creep back into the relationship, and then anything you offer after that is going to be looked at with an eye of skepticism, and it's going to be twisted back into this emotional reptilian stem. So being very concrete, and this last step of rationality turns out to be important. Now, as I mentioned in the article, not everything that John does is magic. So, for instance, when he says, I need you as someone like you, I think he's got the concept right, but I don't think he necessarily has the phrasing right. So, for instance, when I ask my students to evaluate what he says at the end and how they might be able to improve on it, the phrasing that tends to emerge by most people in the room is something along the lines of, what he should have said to the 20-year veteran was that I'd like to offer you the right of first refusal to work with me on these projects and to come to executive meetings with me, which clearly communicates to the rival that you have other options and that this is a scarce resource, but you're also sensitive to how you treat that person and make that person feel relative to you in terms of power, authority, and responsibility. And it's that kind of mixture, something along the lines of, using rhetoric properly to communicate ideas, tends to make this last step work really well. And again, that comes down to thinking beforehand strategically exactly the way you'd like to word the deal and how you present the contract.
And I want to thank you, Brian, for what I consider to be a really, really well thought out template, and for sharing it with us and with our listeners. And for me, it's the very last piece you just talked about, and what your students came up with is the heart of what I like to call my emotion roadmap, which is what would be ideal for this person to feel at the end of the conversation, for both people to feel, and that's really where the improvement in the rhetoric takes place, I think.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for being our guest today. This has been it's been very special to be able to talk with you, and I really appreciate this. I think one of the things that we considered for people to think about is that a lot of times a negative emotion, I think in summary, one of the things that you said that's staying with me is that fear is at the heart of a lot of this. And the second is that maybe the metaphor of look at the red fire-breathing dragon out the window is a nice and easy way to remember, hey, the first step of this is trying to redirect it.
Exactly.
And then the other two steps, this idea of reciprocity seems to me to try to find something of value, and also what sticks with me and I'll remember is that, and the timing of this is really important, and if you don't really feel confident or comfortable with what you want to say, it probably isn't the right time and it probably isn't the right step.
Yes, and the other thing would be, maybe you don't feel comfortable with it now, but in a month from now something could happen and your rival has a new pain point, and at that point in time what you do have to offer may be much more effective.
And the last point about being rational is what seems to me to be what makes it all credible. And you really, I really like the way that your students came up with phrasing it. I actually also liked what John initially said anyway, because many years ago in a book on coaching for improved performance, a fellow named Ferdinand Fernandez talked about being able to tell someone that this is the job, this is what you need to do. And I hope that you're the person that continues to do it, or does it this way, So I think that that's all part of that the idea is people have these suspicions. They're going to have that self-doubt, but if it comes back to yes, they have an agenda, and here's the agenda is they want to work with you, but they have other options. I think that makes it all very real.
Great summary,
well,
Chuck. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you and to have you on the show, Brian. Thank you again for being our guest.
And same here. It was really a delight to be invited and have a chance to talk to you about these ideas.
Thanks. I'll talk to you later.
Take care.
Bye-bye. So, you've been listening to the Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel. This is Chuck Wolf, and you've been listening to WPKN 89.5 FM, listener-supported radio, or streaming live at www.wpkn.org. Have a great week, and remember, if you're not feeling the way you want to feel, take that wheel and control how you feel. We listened to Brian talk about a strategy that really resonates. You can look it up on Harvard Business Review. The article is called Make Your Enemies Your Allies. And it's a wonderful template for thinking about a really strong, powerful strategy that resonates actually physiologically in your body and addresses this deep emotional issue without you having to play psychologist. I really like the concept. I really appreciate Brian being our guest. Thank you all, and have a great week.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.